Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. Today's little mini lecture is going to be about the concept of mutuality in the classroom. Um, Tentatively titled "The Second Kind of Company," which is from a quote by William Stafford that I'm going to read from Bizarro's text about the same topic that you're assigned for this week. Before I get going too far, I want to just sort of say that I am not a communist. I don't have leanings in that direction in particular. However, I do find Frere's and Bizarro's conceptions of pedagogy really appealing, largely because they speak directly to some of my own concerns as a poet. And also, I think many of my students. So a little bit of background on me and how I came up to do this thing. I'm a poet and an essayist and a scholar. And I grew up in a pretty affluent suburb of Boston in Massachusetts, but really hanging on to the bottom level of middle class in Massachusetts. My father was an English teacher and a baseball, football, and basketball coach. He also coached field hockey. Um, he's in the Massachusetts Coaching Hall of Fame, in fact. My mother was a ballet dancer and a ballet instructor who ran a gymnastics and ballet company in my hometown. In a lot of ways, that gave me a lot of privileges. So I was inundated with literature. I was inundated with with music and dance and the arts. So even though we didn't have a lot of money because my dad was a guidance counselor, um, we had enough to get and to have most things. But at the same time, we lived in probably the most blue collar part of town. We were right next to the highway, right next to the railroad tracks. I could walk to the Kmart. So that's kind of the gives you a sense. Yeah, I lived on a dead end dirt road. Um, so it gives you a kind of sense of a sort of complicated worlds that I lived in, surrounded by some pretty blue collar people. And so a lot of my life was kind of code switching from one place to another. I was also an athlete, spent a lot of time in football locker rooms, um, 4 concussions. I wouldn't advise it to most people. Um, but that put me in an interesting place as I moved into creative writing and literature because the kind of stuff that I was interested in, especially when I was a poet, was more in the realm of spoken word or even stuff that I'd hear like punk rock, Joe Strummer, The Clash. That was my idea of poetry. And as I was coming up, I was confronted with having to memorize a lot of Robert Frost and Wallace Stevens and these white modernist poets that were very complex. And I loved them too, but it wasn't the only place I was coming from. So it kind of shocked me as I got into creative writing that there were these kind of like really rigid ideas about what was good writing. And there was a language for it, and there was a whole publication process for it. And I was also kind of shocked by the way in which creative writing was produced through the workshop. And so I've avoided them mostly in my life because I just couldn't fathom the idea of sitting down and giving my work to a group of people who didn't know me or my background and having them tell me everything that was wrong with it. And we used to call this shark festing. And I have to keep my mouth shut the whole time. And so they would do these like incredibly erroneous readings of it based on assumptions of who I was by looking at me instead of understanding my experience. And also, I wasn't writing for the same people that they were writing for. Wanted to get up at a bar and read the poem to people like I was some idea of an Irish poet in the 19th century, right? Um, that was my idea of what I wanted to do. And by the way, that world still exists. I mean, watch Button Poetry sometime, and you'll see that there's a lot of exciting spoken word poetry out in the world today. You might not like it, but that's your preference. And taste is really about class. So I really want you to be thinking about how social class, how our conceptions of what is good or what is acceptable or what is legitimate is often driven by underlying assumptions we don't even always know we have. We've just accepted certain things that people have told us over time. And that actually does as much damage as it does good. Sure, it's a short path to publishing and literary marketplace, but what do you end up with? You end up with an impersonation of what other people are doing that doesn't really come from not just you yourself, but your people and and whoever they are. And I come from a lot of different discourse backgrounds, uh, and I like to employ them all in my work. So that's just something to think about. I want to start with this quotation that Bizarro uses that I think is really, really helpful. Um, it's from William Stafford, who's a phenomenal poet, at least in my opinion, if you want to check him out. But he writes, first, suppose you had a chance to work with someone who would correct your writing into publishability. This person would be efficient, knowing, memorable, valid, an accomplished writer. In the company of this person, you could go confidently into the center of current acceptance. You would quickly learn what brings success in the literary scene. Now suppose another kind of associate. This one would accompany you as you discovered for yourself whatever it is that most satisfyingly links to your own life and writings. You would be living out of your own self into its expression, almost without regard to the slant or expectations or demands of editors and the public. Let there be no mistake about it. A large and significant, and I believe most significant group of writers today would prefer the second kind of company. Sorry, butchered titling the second kind of company, and I get the principal quote wrong. It shows my fallibility. Um, Now you might not agree with it. You might say, no, no, I'm the one I want to publish. But what I would say is, I can teach you what I do, which has led to publication for me, but it probably won't work for you. Or if it does, it will work in a way that's mostly deeply unsatisfying to you. Remember that even if publication is your goal, there are hundreds of literary journals out there in the world that most literary writing is kind of boutique. In other words, that it has specific and very varying different kinds of markets um, directed at different sorts of people. And then there's sort of the big publishers who are looking for very generalized market, which isn't always literary. In other words, there are a lot of audiences, which means there are a lot of ways to do this right. Of course, the scary part of that is there's also a ton of ways to do this wrong. But the first thing you need to figure out is, okay, what is my discourse? What is my discourse community? What kind of language do I use in the world? What is my voice, or what are my voices? Because most writers are actually multivocal. They don't have just one voice. The whole idea of finding your voice is a bit absurd. You already have it. You don't need to find it. And the assumptions that go along with it can be very dangerous. In this chapter, Bizarro quotes Bell Hooks and other writers talking about their experience as writers of color, and then they have some white teachers saying, they write a work in dialect, say it's a black dialect, and they're like, this is the voice you should write, and this is your authentic voice. Now think about how patronizing that is. I mean, just because you're black, therefore you must have to speak a certain way, when most black people in America have to learn to speak in multiple ways just to survive. We call that code switching. So that's insane, right? And we all do that in some degree. You don't talk to me the way you talk to your partner or your parents or your lover or whoever it is. Our discourse, depending on where we are and the situation we are in, changes. And the discourse that we grew up with may not be the primary discourse we're using now. They're both available to you, but they both can sound like very different and distinct voices, and that's okay. That doesn't make you schizophrenic, it makes you human. So what does mutuality? So I'm gonna bring up I'm sorry about the very simple lesson plans that I have. I'm not as technically savvy as some of my peers. I'm a 55-year-old man, and it shows up. But what I've got here is just some words so text and conversation can hit you at the same time. Okay, well, what is mutuality? It's an intrinsic element of the transactional classroom, but it's not the same thing. And it's intrinsic aspect in the sense that both assume that students are bringing to class very valuable things that are worth accessing and paying attention to. Um, it derives from the work, it should say, not for the work, but from the work of Paulo Freire. Let's fix that. So that's the fun part of doing it this way. From the work of Paulo Freire and his pedagogy of the oppressed. a Marxist rereading of education and the educational system. I said before, not a Marxist, but Frere insists on a pedagogy of liberation, focused not on the individual, but on social class. Okay, well, all that sounds very, like storm the barricades Marxism. But what I would say is the reason it's important and applicable is because it focuses on equity in the classroom. And that's really important in writing. Now, if we think about, say, Langston Hughes, to give an example that probably all are familiar with, this just wrote what was legitimized and authorized in the literary world, what he would learn in a university workshop. Um, well, it would have ruined him. Like so much of his excellent writing is written in multiple voices, a lot of them not authorized. So we really do need to rethink our assumptions at all points. But class has quite a bit to do with our assumptions regarding craft. Um, Class has quite a bit to do with our assumptions regarding craft, genre, discourse, language, etc. It can guide our assumptions about voice, dialect, grammar, authenticity, and legitimacy. In other words, like a lot of my peers who are poets and teaching dismiss spoken word poetry. That's classist. They think that they're being rigorous and talking about the value of craft, but it's just classist. So is dismissing fan fiction or genre fiction. There's beautiful genre fiction out into the world. N.K. Jemisin, Octavia Butler, even though I have some problems with him as a person right now, Neil Gaiman, people who can really write. Never mind Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. I mean, there's a whole tradition, right, of science fiction and fantasy writers who are clearly literary by any standard. But I think the point is that doesn't even necessarily need to be the standard. Um, so when we think about our assumptions about what is literary writing, um, well, first of all, we need to challenge those assumptions. We also need to challenge that literary writing is necessarily a value. Mutuality encourages us to assume that everyone, it's the only assumption that we get to hold on to, by the way. Assume that everyone in the creative writing classroom has a right to interpretive agency. Well, what does interpretive agency mean? It means that all students have a right to interpret um, and to articulate that interpretation about everything, about the assignment, about the reading. Teacher comes in with a text and they start by saying, "This is the best poem I've ever read." Student has every right to challenge that and say, "Okay, well, I accept that this is what you believe is a great poem, but here are my issues with it." That's legitimate, and that's a conversation. So we may or may not all come to the same conclusions, but everyone has a right to speak. All right, so that is your interpretation is as valuable as mine as a teacher. This, of course, causes some anxiety about standards and can frustrate students who are taking a class because they want a quick route and guide to publishing in a particular market. It can also frustrate teachers who, frankly, are box checkers. They want to have everything follow a very easily definable rubric and to be able to give grades based on that. We'll get to grading another time. That's the back end of this. But yes, this causes complications in terms of grading and assessment. And but if your assumption in taking this class is I'm going to simplify your life, I am sorry to disappoint you. It is no teacher's job to simplify your life. We complicate your life because we're always introducing new information and new ideas. Our job is to unsettle you, to challenge you with new things so that you can develop. Even if you leave the discussion believing the same thing that you did when you came in, now you believe it in with the knowledge of other ideas that are out there in the world. There's nothing offensive about being presented with an alternative. But the value of pedagogy of mutuality is that it creates a classroom focused on a student's experiences world, and language, helping them to live out their lives through writing and ultimately be more satisfied with the work they create and more likely continue to write. In other words, we're creating a classroom where a student doesn't feel silenced, doesn't feel dismissed, doesn't feel left behind or excluded from the conversation, and therefore they are able to develop their work in a nurturing, supportive environment instead of an oppressive one. And I think that if you really think about your writing lives, I'm sure that you can think of a teacher that you found to be oppressive, and they all share the same thing. The one they all those oppressive teachers share one common trait. They believe that they know what is right and what is best. It starts there. And that's a person that needs therapy, because they need to understand that their version of what that we can only know what is right and what is best for ourselves. We can offer options to students. We can encourage them, affirm them, develop their skills, and even bring new ones to the table for them to try. Um, but we are not the source of all knowledge. Um, and we do not have all the answers. And that is a hard lesson that you have to come through as an educator. What approaches value mutuality? It all starts with discourse. It always starts with language and the opening of the conversation. Everything should be up for discussion. Every craft term, every genre trope, every grammar concept. When we ask the question, what is good? We should, like a teacher, should not have a predetermined answer in mind. That that question of value should always be up for negotiation. Instead of a teacher fixing a poem, which assumes that it's broken, instead of the class shark festing a poem or essay or a piece of fiction, instead of a student coming to a teacher's office to make their work better, the focus is on active listening, offering multiple pathways, development, focusing on the project instead of the result, etc. In this version of the creative writing classroom, there are no silent workshops, since the writer is a valuable part of the discussion about the text. That's just a few things, and we're going to explore others. So once since we're opening this up to discourse, one thing that you should be thinking about as we move forward is, okay, well, what are the limits of a classroom that focuses on mutuality, and what are the advantages, say, of the silent workshop? What things make you nervous or anxious about this pedagogy? Because it's not the only one. Just like there's no single process, there's no single best pedagogy, because there's no single type of learner as students. Um, and that's just something that we all have to learn as we grow as writers. Um, Finding a teacher is just as important as finding a listener, finding a reader, finding a colleague, finding someone to share work with. And the question we're asking ourselves in this class is, what kind of teacher do you want to be? Having experienced all the different possibilities that are out there. All right. I hope this was helpful to you. Um, I know that the Bizarro reading was really long, and simply the last name of the writer engenders a whole lot of jokes. But I found it liberating to read and interesting. The first time I read it, it challenged a lot of my assumptions about the way I approach the class, because I tend to be an individualist, focusing on expression. And this made me think that, rethink about what individuality really is. Um, we all come from communities, we all come from a place, and we all struggle with that feeling of being on the outside of various communities. And class is a way to keep us all in boxes, especially social class. But we don't want the classroom to be like that. Okay, I hope that was effective. and helped you kind of grapple with the reading that we're doing for this week. And until next time, thank you very much.